We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
The 90s. The days where Sega wasn't afraid to shoot themselves in the foot. I guess that's admittedly a good thing they've given that up these days. Anyways, today's console is one with a gigantic cult following and one hell of an interesting development process. It was one of the most botched yet fantastic consoles to come from the gaming giant Sega. Today, we are talking about the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was Sega's entry into the 5th generation of home consoles. The console began its retail life on November 2nd, 1994, when it was released to the general populace of Japan. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, the console hit store shelves in North America on May 11th, 1995, European shelves on July 8th, 1995, and Australia is kind of weird because, well, they got it before Europe, so that means they didn't get screwed this time. But we don't know exactly when they got it, we just know they got it before Europe, so there you go. And like most consoles that I personally observed, Asia had a really patchy release as well, although funnily enough, it was marketed in South Korea as the Samsung Saturn by Samsung, so there's that, which helps me get into the point that there are literally a billion variations on the Saturn. I cannot count all of them, that would be impossible, I would be here for multiple years. The console has a very odd hardware architecture, with two Hitachi SH2 CPUs clocked at 28.6 MHz, which would prove to be very problematic for developers. And as far as graphics hardware is concerned, the console features both VDP1 and VDP2 video display processors. You get two for the price of multiple. Accessories for the Saturn include things like wireless control pads, the video CD decoder that allowed the console to play video CDs in-game and out, and things like RAM expansions so that you could actually expand the RAM of the console, which would be useful for certain games. The Saturn was super early to the internet access party with the Netlink peripheral that allowed you to play online in 1996. The Saturn definitely got its share of third-party controllers, and got an interesting first-party one called the 3D control pad. Of course, you had accessories like the Stunner light gun for games like Virtua Cop. Oh yeah, and since I mentioned Netlink earlier, yeah, you can still play on Netlink today. That's not a joke, people have revived it. The fan community has revived it, much like they've done with the Dreamcast, so if you want to play your Saturn games online with someone, go right ahead. The Saturn is a very good console to collect for, with titles like Panzer Dragoon 2, Nights into Dreams, and Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is one of the most sought-after games of all time. And there's a few ports like Doom and SimCity on there, which may catch your attention. I could sit here for quite a while naming off gems on this console, but yeah, I don't want to be here for that long, so I kinda have to get on with the history lesson. It all started in 1991. Even so close after the release of the Sega Genesis, there was talk all over the world regarding Sega's next potential console to hit the home market. There were plenty of rumors as to what the new console might end up being, especially with Nintendo's Super Famicom beginning to dominate markets in Japan. So what did Sega do instead of unveiling the Saturn and changing the world forever? Well, they released the Sega Cd. Their ideology behind the Sega Cd is that, wow, the Genesis is way turbo popular in the United States, so let's release an add-on for that and not piss around with the new console. That kinda backfired. So did the 32X. You weren't really using your brain, Sega. I'm sorry. The concept of a complete new console generation or cycle wasn't quite understood in 1993 as it is today. As a result, the release of the Sega CD quieted the rumors of what would eventually become the Saturn for some time. Sega was seriously feeling the heat as the 5th generation kicked off, what with a myriad of more technologically capable consoles releasing and failing left and right. The glossy 3D output of these new consoles really made Sega's current machine look childish in comparison, which to Sega was extremely embarrassing, not to mention bad for their profits. Sega had to react, and fast. The Sega Cd and 32X just would not take off, and Sega had to resort to the next trick they had up their sleeve: Project Saturn. A group of 27 people at Sega began to work on this Project Saturn. It was to be a CD-based console that would carry the company into the 5th generation, something to destroy the Super Nintendo and compete with the fancy, yet eventually failed, 3D-driven consoles like the 3DO. The team had a wide range of talent, including engineers, product development specialists, and marketing specialists. This team was led by Hideki Sato, who is also responsible for designing and developing Sega's prior consoles. Sato and his associates worked tirelessly for around 2 years, attempting to develop a console that would be far ahead of its time, featuring the best hardware and software that could possibly have been stuck in a console. As time advanced through 1993, the console would have very little information as to what this Project Saturn really was. The only details outsiders could speculate on at this point were basic technical aspects of the console, buzzwords like 32-bit and 64-bit architecture. People knew it would feature a CD-ROM drive and possibly an accompanying cartridge slot as well, although the finer details of why this was wouldn't be known until the console was revealed. It was wrongly speculated, however, that the console would feature Mega Drive or Genesis compatibility, but sadly that was not meant to be. Sega of America began to openly speak of 32-bit consoles later in 1993, with Tom Kalinske, who is the CEO of Sega of America at the time, outlining Sega's existing track history of 32-bit arcade machines. He stated that Sega could release a new, extremely capable console as soon as tomorrow. The biggest issue with this, however, would be the price tag. Kalinske did not want to market a machine priced at over $500, and hardware prices were not set to drop to manageable levels within 1993 or 94. Electronic Gaming Monthly reported that Project Saturn would run on a Motorola-based CPU, which even further debunked rumors that the console would be Mega Drive or Genesis compatible. Of course, only half of this was correct, as the final console shipped with a dual CPU configuration of 2 Hitachi SH2 CPUs. More information quote-unquote leaked regarding the video hardware on the console, suggesting the Saturn would ship as a 32-bit system running on a single NEC V60 equivalent graphics processor clocked at 27 MHz. Suggested specs included a palette of 16.7 million colors, an alpha channel for sprites, and the system being capable of displaying and animating over 16,000 polygons per frame. This was equivalent to 480,000 polygons per second when running at 30 frames per second. It was speculated that the console would retail for around $400 US. On September 21st, 1993, Sega themselves publicly announced a joint venture with Hitachi with the intention of producing a 32-bit video game and multimedia machine. It was stated that Hitachi would be responsible for building the processor in the system. At this point, the idea of Genesis/Mega Drive support was entirely ruled out. It would cost far too much money for Sega to build Genesis hardware inside of an already expensive console, and emulation would also not be an option, as by the early 1990s, emulation was far from heard of, let alone possible. The world was buzzing with talk of the Sega Saturn by 1994. Developers were reportedly receiving primitive development hardware that was apparently vastly superior to the Amiga CD32, the Atari Jaguar, and the 3DO. As far as the public was concerned, the presence of the VDP chips that ended up in the console had not been heard of yet. Edge magazine reported that the Saturn possessed an SH7032 RISC CPU running at 27 MHz at its heart. Again, this was not the case, as Sega opted for 2 Hitachi SH2 CPUs and an SH1 slapped in to control the CD-ROM drive. Over here in America, Tom Kalinske was apparently never impressed by the plans for Saturn's hardware, but Sega of Japan didn't really give a damn and told him to shut the hell up, long story short. They didn't give Sega of America any say in how the console was to be developed. Kalinske's statement, which ultimately proved to be correct, was that he did not see the Saturn as a console that could sell in North America as it then stood. It was not built in a way that would please or be workable by Western developers, and Kalinske was fearful that the competition would bite into Sega's market share quickly as a result. Desperately, Kalinske went so far as to go against his Japanese superiors and seek out an alternative graphics chip for the Saturn. He approached James H. Clark of Silicon Graphics, or SGI, who was collaborating with MIPS Computer Systems, who'd SGI had acquired. They were collaborating on a low-cost, real-time 3D graphics system. Talks were had between Sega of America and SGI, but naturally it fell through due to that pesky Sega of Japan. They weren't keen on changing out hardware and having far too many issues with the brand new architecture. It was far too risky for Japan to manage. Funnily enough, however, Nintendo picked up the deal with SGI for the Nintendo 64 in the summer of 1993. As long as we're throwing other companies into the mix, Sony Electronic Publishing turned to Sega of America for help to get into the console race. The PlayStation project was not thought of highly by Sony executives in Japan, and Sega of America, who were impressed by the PlayStation project, were all for getting Sony on board to create a hybrid console between the two companies. Of course, Japan said no due to their perception of Sony's lack of experience in the gaming industry. The only deal that actually came of these talks, though, was between Sony, ImageSoft, Sega, and Digital Pictures. They worked together to test out CD-based game development prior to the deal's complete collapse. This deal manifested itself in some of the terrible FMV games on Sega Cd. Eventually, Sony swept one of Kalinski's employees right out from under him when they hired on Steve Race. He would challenge Sega head-on at E3 1995. $299. In early 1994, Akitoshi Oikawa of Sega filed a patent for what looks to be a cartridgeless Saturn console. The first time that Project Saturn had actually been seen by people other than those at Sega was at Winter CES 1994. The console was referenced briefly during a run of marketing loops featuring Sega Cd and Genesis game. The console appeared as a partially obscured, grayscale render of a concept Sega Saturn model. On February 16, 1994, the Saturn made its second appearance at Imagina 94, where Yuzo Naritomi held a conference called Virtua Sega where he detailed some of the basic hardware specifications as they stood at the time. None of what was displayed, however, was the actual Sega hardware. Most of the renders were created with top-end SGI hardware. Alongside Project Saturn, Sega was also working on what was referred to as Project Jupiter. It was a cartridge-only based 32-bit system. The big difference between the two was a CD-ROM drive. At one point, the Saturn was supposed to run disk and cartridge software. Ultimately, however, the Saturn's cartridge port was downgraded so that it could only use expansions like RAM cards. The Jupiter project was basically a Saturn without a CD drive, but it could have been upgraded at a later point to create a makeshift Saturn console. By February 1994, Project Jupiter had been publicly axed by Sega, and in its place, Project Mars was introduced. Project Mars was an add-on to the Genesis to hold consumers off until the Saturn hit, and to extend the lifespan of the Genesis. You may know Project Mars as the Sega 32X. The Mars and Saturn had some overlap in technology, what with the two SH2 processors that ended up in the Saturn also making their way into the 32X. These CPUs in the 32X, however, were underclocked significantly. Between the Saturn, there are a ton of confused development projects. It's confusing even me as I write this sentence in the script. Some 32X games were converted to Saturn games, and a lot of projects were just axed altogether. Seriously, talk about complicated. There were reportedly some 32X games mislabeled as Saturn software. Yeah, I don't understand it either. What the f***, Sega? Compatibility seemed obvious between the Saturn's cartridge functionality and the 32X's cartridge functionality, yet they weren't compatible, and blah 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 blah. What a frickin' mess. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Sega was absolutely mental. Anyways, moving on to something that actually makes sense, the 32X created a lot of customer divide. It was expensive, cumbersome, yet you need like 28 power bricks to like power up the Genesis, the CD, it's ridiculous, and was quickly discontinued. This absolutely demolished customer confidence and future Saturn sales. The whole 32X debacle is a great example of why you really shouldn't try and maintain two consoles at once. Drop one and work on the other, guys. Holy crap. In March of 1994, the Sega Saturn was seen for the first time proper by consumers in Japan. This was at the Customer Group show. The press was provided with a handful of hardware photos and the console's logo. The console was proudly revealed to the public by Hayao Nakayama, but what he presented was not an actual console. Reportedly, it was simply a painted wooden mock-up, not an actual Saturn unit. Regardless, footage was shown of prototype Saturn hardware running none other than Virtua Fighter. The Saturn on display was much like the final Japanese design released in Japan known as the HST-0001, but there was one key difference. It was silver as opposed to gray. Another notable detail is the text printed on the display. It read High Performance CD-ROM/Cartridge Entertainment System, indicating that Sega, even so close to release, was still considering full cartridge functionality as opposed to the downgraded version we actually received. Later on in 1994, the console's hardware was available to play for the first time at the Tokyo Toy Show held on June 2nd, 1994. At this point, the Saturn hardware was mostly complete, but still needed to be fully refined and condensed into its final retail form. The actual unit on display again was only a shell, and a few prototype controllers and accessories were available to the public. The event featured a few early Saturn games, most of which were considered to be unplayable. Some tech demos like Daytona USA, Victory Goal, and Clockwork Knight showed up in incomplete form. A lot of games were announced for the Saturn, but the Sony PlayStation mostly stole the show from Sega. EGM reported in Japan, however, that the Saturn was to retail for 49,800 Japanese yen or less, and they correctly reported that the console would have two SH2 RISC CPUs. A few other details include a Motorola 68000 chip driving the sound, and that the console would handle 16.77 million colors. This hardware is roughly the same as the final model. The final price was announced by Sega at 44,800 yen, mostly marked down to compete with the looming PlayStation. Towards the end of 1994, having spent most of the year focusing on the 32X instead of the Saturn, Sega of Japan announced a final tweak to the console's aesthetics, stating that their new gray model was more universal than the silver found in the prototype. It was at this point that the deals with Hitachi and JVC came in as well, with the concept of manufacturers making their own Saturns, similar to what the 3DO was doing. Hitachi used this as an opportunity to slam the Saturn onto their shelves in an attempt to get more consoles into homes. Finally, the Saturn's set release date for Japan was finalized for November 22nd, 1994. The Saturn finally released in Japan on the aforementioned date with 5 titles. They were Virtua Fighter, Wanchai Connection, Mahjong Goku whatever that is, A Port of Mist, and Tama. The Japanese launch was monitored closely with the intention of repeating a successful launch in Western markets. Yeah, that didn't work out too well, did it? Supposedly, around 500,000 units were available for sale on release day, but Sega held back on 300,000 in storage for a week in an attempt to catch the infantile PlayStation off guard. The console launch would be the most successful of all time for Sega, as they sold 170,000 units in the first 24 hours. For perspective, Sony shipped 100,000 total units to Japanese retailers at launch. Pre-orders for the console reportedly sold out 2 weeks in advance, and queues for the system were several hours long. To entertain and control the crowds while they waited, Sega staff dressed as the Coneheads featured in early Saturn advertising. Apart from the HST-0001 release model, the V Saturn and High Saturn were available from JVC and Hitachi, but they were considerably harder to find and are worth quite a bit today. While the figures would suggest that Sony's PlayStation was in a better position than the Saturn, this wasn't necessarily the case, as while the PlayStation was cheap, all the software had to be purchased separately at launch, making the PlayStation a more expensive purchase overall. Meanwhile, Virtua Fighter cemented the Saturn pretty well, with the game being one of the most successful Japanese arcade games of all time. Many people bought the Saturn for the sole purpose of being able to play Virtua Fighter at home. This was a huge deal. As a result, Sega used the Virtua Fighting franchise as a primary force for the console in the Japanese market. Many of the reasons for the Saturn's early praise come down to the fact that Sega, unlike Sony, were fully experienced in the gaming industry. This experience manifested itself in the design of the Saturn. For instance, the leads of the Saturn's controllers were far longer than the PlayStation's, and that does add to a better experience. Remember the little tiny nubs on the NES Classic? That was awful. That was It's gross. On top of things like more polished hardware were things like Sega's software prowess. Sega, while not having been a market leader as far as gaming consoles were concerned in Japan, they were known for being on the cutting edge of game software. This was especially apparent with their arcade games. Meanwhile, Sony was primarily known as a broad consumer electronics company. They were known for developing things like Discman and Walkman. No one had a ton of confidence in them as far as gaming was concerned, and the company had a lot to prove in the video game sector. By the end of Christmas 1994, 500,000 Saturn units had been sold in Japan. This included 50,000 V Saturns, and this was far ahead of the PlayStation, which had only sold 300,000 units by this point. By March 1995, both Sony and Sega were reporting 600,000 units sold. While the 32X had the potential to ruin the Saturn brand as it had in the United States, Sega of Japan acted wisely, in their land at least, and was quick to axe the add-on in Japan. They did so before it could deal any long-lasting damage to the Saturn in Japan. Furthermore, almost all production on anything Genesis ended upon Saturn's launch. By mid-1995, 1 million Saturn units had been sold in Japan, and as somewhat of a celebratory measure, Sega dropped the price of the console to 34,800 yen. This model was packed with Virtua Fighter Remix. Sony would somewhat catch up sales-wise by mid-1995, but Sega came back out on top, winning the 1995 Christmas season. This win was thanks to what were affectionately referred to as the Big Three. These were Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally Championship, and Virtua Cop. Sega felt that about 50% more Saturns were being sold than PlayStations in the first half of 1996, and a spring price drop further cemented their reign over the Japanese market. Speaking of the Japanese market, Sega's share rose from 12% to 32% in 1995, with Nintendo dropping drastically from 75 down to 33. By early 1996, around 2.2 million Saturn consoles had been sold in Japan, which was over half of the total worldwide sales of the Saturn at that point. The console was absolutely blowing up over there. On March 22nd, Sega released a redesigned white model for the asking price of 20,000 yen. This was apparently an attempt to make 32-bit gaming more accessible and adoptable to the Japanese public. This move meant that the Saturn cost less than the near 6-year-old Super Famicom, and buying games for the console was far less expensive as well, since Sega opted for CD technology instead of expensive cartridges. 70,000 of these white units were sold in 4 days, with supplies struggling to keep up with demand. By November 1996, 3.7 million units had been sold in Japan. Things really started to heat up in Japan by the beginning of 1997, with the PlayStation finally gaining the edge on Saturn. The release of Final Fantasy VII caused the PlayStation numbers to absolutely explode, forcing the Saturn into second place. By 1997, 5 million units had been sold in Japan. The Saturn finally started faltering by the middle of 1997 when Sega's entire corporate structure underwent a meltdown, with frustrations in the US and a failed merger with Bandai making the news for all the wrong reasons. There was also the ongoing Saturn II project, a console the Japanese didn't really need. By the way, the Saturn II would ultimately become the Dreamcast, and it's explained in my console overview on the Dreamcast, which you should totally watch. Despite all this mess, the Saturn did continue to sell well in Japan, especially due to the ongoing Segata Sanchido ad campaign, which was quite entertaining to say the least. The series of commercials consisted of a martial artist who would travel the country, punishing those who did not play Saturn. The Saturn definitely flourished in Japan, but that's about it. Everywhere else, the Saturn was either unknown or uninteresting when compared to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. As has been referenced on numerous occasions already, the Saturn really had a tough time outside of Japan. Those who loyally followed Sega were indeed ecstatic about the console's upcoming release, but were quieted by the reported hefty price tag in the US. Sega of America, who thought from nearly the beginning that the Saturn would not work in North America, or really anywhere else but Japan, continued to focus on the Genesis. They focused on the Genesis as it had pummeled Nintendo for 3 years in a row during the great 4th generation console war in the US, and the console continued to grow even in 1995, holding about 50% of the hardware and software market in the region. Sega of America never really focused on the Saturn at all. They were foolishly toying around with things like the Sega Cd and 32X, which were massive failures. They openly discussed the Saturn, but never really supported it. Sega did eventually announce the release of the console in the United States. It was set to be on Saturn Day, September 2nd, 1995. Kalinske initially delayed the release this far as he wanted at least 10 games available for the console if it was to be sold in the region. The initial plan, however, was to have 20 games at launch and have the console backed by a $50 million advertising campaign. Yeah, things didn't exactly work out as planned. They never do. This is Sega, so yeah. When Sega caught wind of Sony's American plans in North America, Sega jumped the gun. On stage at Sega's E3 1995 press conference, it was announced that the Saturn would be immediately available, as in right now, all across the United States. It would have 6 launch titles and launch for $399 or $449, packed with Virtua Fighter. This was not only very jarring to the audience, but was one of the worst decisions made in the gaming industry ever. Sony responded in the following hours with one of Kalinske's old employees, as we mentioned earlier, dropping the $299 bomb, referring to the price of the console at launch. Naturally, the crowd went insane. Fundamentally, Sega was not at all prepared for the launch that they had just dropped on themselves. Sega could only really supply select retailers, prioritizing Babbage's, EB, Software, etc., and Toys R Us. Apparently no retailers profited from the $399 price tag, instead only relying on software sales to make up the difference. Sega was able to ship 30,000 units to retailers at launch, but as demand greatly outstripped supply, Sega were forced to stagger the console's release across the summer, starting with select US cities, and further retailers like Sears, Walmart, Target, Circuit City, and Best Buy. As far as the US launch is concerned, 60,000 units in total, not over the course of like a day or any. 60,000 units in total were thought to have sold in the entire launch period. In North America, the situation was somewhat backwards compared to Japan. The PlayStation was being praised and the Saturn was just sort of forgotten. The PlayStation appeared to be the more technologically capable unit over here and therefore sold better in North America, whereas in Japan, Sony was looked at as being naive, and Sega was looked at as being lovely and brand new technology. The biggest issue with the Saturn over here is that it was designed around a Japanese market, not a Western one, and because of the fact that the Japanese did not listen at all to Westerners, that added to the damage it caused. The PlayStation launched in North America as planned on September 9th, 1994, and in doing so scared the crap out of Sega. The PlayStation launch broke multiple records, and both the hardware and software were being highly praised by critics. PlayStation's port of Namco's Ridge Racer, which was technologically inferior when compared to Daytona USA on arcades, looked far better on PlayStation than Daytona USA looked on Saturn. This gave the impression that the Saturn was a weaker console. Issues like these demonstrated that the Saturn was actually ill-equipped for modern 3D gaming as it was then known. Sega forecasted that 600,000 Saturns would be sold in the US by 1995, but there were a myriad of issues that, caused that to not happen. In the end, 80,000 Saturns had been sold in North America before the PlayStation came along, the likes of which had already amassed over 100,000 pre-orders. PlayStation went on to sell around 130,000 consoles in its first week on the market. One of the funny things about PlayStation's launch, however, is that Sony could not meet demand for game cases and therefore had to purchase some long box style cases from Sega in order to actually push their games out. This explains why in the US the likes of Rayman and Battle Arena Toshinden originally shipped in Saturn style cases. After PlayStation released, Sega went on the offensive, offering a 3-game deal for customers purchasing Saturns between the 2nd and 30th of September, with Clockwork Knight, Worldwide Soccer, or Virtua Fighter Remix being available in addition to the already bundled Virtua Fighter. As was very much expected, the Saturn dropped its price to $299 on October 2nd, and a replacement bundle pack now containing Virtua Fighter Remix was being sold at $349.99. At this point, Sega was reporting that 120,000 units had been sold, with Tom Kalinske claiming that PS had sold less. Sony was actually claiming a 200,000 figure, however. Even the 3DO is thought to have outsold the Saturn in its launch period. It too was priced around $100 cheaper, and by the end of 1995, NPD data was suggesting that the PlayStation was outselling Saturn 2-1. In 1996, to counteract some of their losses, Sega of America pulled the plug on the Sega Cd and the Sega Nomad, while finally shifting its focus away from the 32X. Sega's product line was basically reduced to 3, including the Genesis, Game Gear, and the Saturn. The Saturn's price was dropped to $249 in late March of 1996, having sold 500,000 units at this point. 3 million Saturn games had been sold at this point versus 8 million PlayStation games. Sega tried a marketing push with the Netlink, the first real attempt to create an online gaming platform, but that too failed to catch on. With desktop PCs having online gaming in the bag, and Sega's already failing Saturn sales, Netlink was just not meant to be. By May 1996, the Saturn had sold 600,000 units versus PlayStation's 1.2 million. E3 1996 saw the PlayStation drop its price to $199.99, to which the Saturn was forced to follow, despite being more expensive to manufacture. This led to one of the classic E3 moments in which, after Sega started putting up signs across its booth, its marketing staff got into an altercation with Sony's on the show floor. Saturn sales did go up as a result of the price drop, however, particularly as Nintendo did not want to move from their $249 price tag for their new Nintendo 64. Sega of America soon began the process of an internal breakdown, with Tom Kalinske losing interest in fighting an ever more frustrated Japanese arm pulling the strings in the US. Kalinske resigned in July, followed by David Rosen and Hayao Nakayama. Sega of America began pushing more towards an educational and web-based market and became something of a non-entity to the mainstream consumer. Saturn sales likely peaked with the launch of Nights into Dreams, the most successful piece of Saturn software up to that point. The gap between the Saturn and the PlayStation would continue to widen and never close, and the public became more and more disinterested with Sega's efforts. Sega, in a move of desperation, tried to boost sales and fight off Nintendo's new console, their N64, with the triple pack, bundling new Saturn consoles with 3 pieces of first-party software, which were Virtua Fighter 2, Daytona USA, and Virtua Cop. Sega also reduced the top price of new software from $69.99 down to $59.99. The triple pack promotion saw Saturn sales rise by 500%, with an estimated 400,000 consoles being sold in the offer's first 2 weeks. Going into the Christmas period, 900,000 Saturns were thought to have been sold that year thus far. Sega sold 1.2 million Saturns in 1996. This, combined with its 400,000 figure from the triple pack promotion, brought total sales in North America to 3.2 million. Console sales in general were up in the first quarter of 1997, and according to NPD figures, Saturn sales had risen by about 135% compared to Q1 1996. Although, for comparison, PlayStation sales had risen by about 170% at this point. During the first 3 months of 1997, the N64 pushed far ahead of the Saturn, hitting about 2.3 million units in March. This was countered by a PlayStation price cut to $149.95 in January of 1997. On average, the Saturn was selling about 77,000 consoles a month in the US versus the 195,000 PS1s and 383,000 Nintendo 64s. Meanwhile, talk about new consoles was engulfing Sega, awkwardly headed by the new Sega of America CEO Bernie Stolar, who openly talked down the Saturn at E3 1997, saying that the Saturn is not our future. 2 weeks before E3 1997, in June, the cheapest Saturn package was lowered to $149.99, with software capped at $49.99. With a pack-in, the price was $169, and the Netlink bundle was set at $249.99. By August, Sony controlled 47% of the next-generation market, Nintendo controlled 40%, and Sega controlled a measly 12%. It was around this point that Sega began to just give up on the Saturn. With developers canceling their Saturn projects and Sega's complete lack of faith in their own platform, the news was broken in 1998 that Sega was abandoning it. Retailers began to pull units from shelves, and Sega discontinued their ad campaigns. A last wave of third-party titles, including The House of the Dead, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Burning Rangers, and Shining Force 3 were pushed out in 1998, and it was generally accepted after that the console had expired. With things like Sega's own lack of faith in the US, the complete lack of cooperation between Japan and America, and the lack of interest in the console in general, the Saturn was destined to be a failure in the United States. Many of the games that made the Saturn so great in Japan didn't release anywhere else, and we never got a proper Sonic game for the console either, which most likely would have been a system seller. The hardware in the console was not nearly as advanced as its competitors in the 5th generation, and it was very much technologically outshined defined by the PS1 and N64. Above all, however, was the distrust that Sega created with their customers. Their foolish antics with the Sega Cd and 32X created a ton of divide, and the entire Saturn release was an absolute disaster. Customer confidence was not at all helped when Bernie Stolar shunned his company's own hardware. In Japan, the Saturn very much was a success, but again, that's about it. Japan didn't design the console around anything other than the Japanese market and did not listen at all to their Western counterparts, and they paid for it. But the blame can't entirely be put on Japan, of course. Why the US saw the 32X as anything more than a garbage can is far beyond me, and is a very big reason for the Saturn's failure. Corporate politics aside, I think we can all agree that the Saturn is an incredible system, and it's actually kind of special in that it kicked off this YouTube channel as we now know it. It's actually possible that if it weren't for the Saturn, this channel would not exist as it does today. Despite all the controversy surrounding the system and all the money issues and all that crap, the Saturn really is worth your time, what with its great library and wonderful 90s charm. The Sega Saturn is a console that will always have a special place in my heart. Well, there you have it. Be sure to check out part 2 when I do release it. It's going to be more on the hardware aspect and a few things that I forgot to mention in this one because it is just a bit too long. I don't want to make it too long or else, audience retention will go to crap, and I don't really want that. And you don't want that because, well, let's be honest, not a lot of people are here to watch a super, insanely long video. So I am going to do it in 2 parts this time, so be sure to keep an eye on that. But if you did like this one, be sure to give it a like, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.